Good morning, and welcome to Connections Radio Show, where we talk about ideas that matter. And I'm glad you've made the connection and are with us today. I'm Laurie Fitz, your host, and the goal of our show is to explore a wide range of topics that challenge us to see ourselves, our community, and the world around us in ways that get us thinking, get us exploring, get us connected, and perhaps inspired or challenged to do just a bit more because we've made that connection. So today we are going into the bright sunshine, Minnesota lighting the way for civil rights. Long before the national headlines of the mid-1950s, a transformative battle for justice was being fought right here in the streets of Minneapolis. I'm excited to have you join Connections Radio Show today and learn a little bit more about some of the hidden history that you may not know of the Black-Jewish coalition that turned the Twin Cities from a capital of bigotry into a launch pad for the national civil rights movement. And today we have award-winning author Samuel Freedman. He will be diving into his acclaimed book, Into the Bright Sunshine. And this is coming out in paperwork this fall. Go check your Amazon for getting this book. It's amazing. And in his book, he reveals the gritty early career of Mayor Hubert Humphrey and the local foot soldiers who pushed him to change American politics forever. We also have joining with us Buck Humphrey, grandson of Vice President Hubert Humphrey, currently the vice chair of the 3rd Congressional District DFL. In 2002, he was the DFL nominee for the Secretary of State. And unfortunately, that was also the same year that we lost Wellstone, a year to remember. He started in DFL in 94. He's been Hillary Clinton's campaign manager here. He's been Gore's campaign manager here. From 2009 to 2012, he was the chief of office communications for citizenship and immigration and also interned for Biden. And I know you have some wonderful stories, especially about being part of the citizenship and immigration.
Yeah, USCIS is the non-enforcement side of immigration at the federal level. I had the distinct privilege to work with then Director Mayorkas, who became Secretary of Homeland Security under President Biden. That was in the Obama administration, so it's great, worked with Secretary Napolitano. And unfortunately, it's certainly turned into something different under this current administration. The one thing I'll say also, though, in terms of my grandfather is, I was 8 when he passed. I knew Grandpa as Grandpa Humphrey and kind of did all our things, and he made sure I had cheeseburgers and lake for bean feeds and things like that.
I love that.
But I've been absolutely humbled throughout my life to be the benefactor of so many awesome stories and the true highest ideals and morals and way of governing that we all as a people who governs ourselves would hope to get to. And so that comes from across the aisle too. Jesse Helms, others who didn't see eye to eye with my grandfather, but they certainly were good friends.
And another good friend of yours is Mike Rothman.
The best.
And Mike is
been
here.
Wonderful.
Mike is here today, Mike Rothman, former Minnesota Commerce Commissioner, currently active in election and campaign law, which I believe will probably come in handy this year. We'll be relying on a lot of your insights. And you've also ran for Attorney General for Minnesota, 2018. You've been active in the DFL for many years, and your family has been active in Minnesota DFL for generations.
Many, many years. It's really an honor and privilege to be here this morning and talking with Sam, and especially sitting next to my good friend Buck and talking about Hubert Humphrey. I remember as a kid going into, it was 1960 when my mom voted for Humphrey back in 68. She brought me into the voting booth, and I know we'll be talking about voting rights and things like that, but that was a pivotal moment as I grew up. I just remember that vividly in my mind, and to be sitting here in studio today talking about these things is absolutely amazing. So
very special.
Glad we're having the show.
I am thrilled that we can celebrate his legacy, because I think often he gets pigeonholed into just one area, and he did so much for so many, and I love being able to celebrate that. And I'm grateful to Kit Bix, who's also here today, who helped pull this together and bring individuals together so that we could have the show. Kit is a DFL activist, a retired academic, and the lead producer of our Other Jewish Voices series on Connections.
Hi.
Thank you, Kit. So why does it matter to look back over 70 years? This isn't just a history lesson. It's a masterclass in coalition building, something that we can go to school on during these difficult times we find ourselves in. Hubert Humphrey helped to create the blueprint for civil rights in Minneapolis, and I think you'd be very proud of the Twin Cities receiving the John F. Kennedy Profile in Courage Award for fighting bigotry and risking their lives to protect their neighbors and immigrant community members during the Metro Surge. So, Samuel, I'd love to have you set the stage for us in this conversation and sharing with us a little bit of Hubert Humphrey's background and his run for the mayor of Minneapolis. And give us context of how he really created the blueprint for civil rights.
Well, let me pick up that story to begin with. In the spring of 1945, mayoral elections back then were held in the spring, and 1945 was the second time Hubert Humphrey had run for mayor. He ran in 1943 against a conservative Republican incumbent, guy named Marvin Klein. And in that race, Humphrey had been recruited by people from organized labor, and he ran a pretty conventional kind of campaign. He ran on cleaning up crime along Hennepin Avenue, which was filled with gambling, particularly. He emphasized being of Norwegian background. He emphasized his ties to labor. Nothing the matter with any of those positions, but for someone who is a liberal Democrat, that was sort of standard issue. And he was a great campaigner, though even then, no one expected that he would give Klein a run for his money, but he very nearly upset him because all the things we came to see later in Hubert Humphrey's life, his love of retail politics, his genuine interest in people, his great speaking skills, as long as he didn't go on too long, served him well. But then in 1945, he runs again against Marvin Klein, and this is a significantly different race because this is the race in which civil rights becomes the key issue for Hubert Humphrey. And part of the context is that this race is happening, as I said, April, May of 1945. It's at the same time that the war in Europe is coming to an end, which means that both the Soviet Red Army and the Allied armies are liberating concentration camps. And the first footage, the first newsreels of the final solution, the Holocaust, are being shown in movie theaters. The first articles by American reporters written in English about the final solution are being published in newspapers all over the country, including the Star and Tribune in Minneapolis. And also, you're beginning to have the return of both African-American and Jewish soldiers who'd been in World War II. And Black soldiers had a term that I think is broadly relevant. They called it double V. And double V meant victory over fascism abroad and then victory over Jim Crow at home. And Jewish soldiers didn't have a term like that, but they had the same idea of we're going to literally try to save our relatives, our blood relatives, and our co-religionists from Hitler. And then when we come back here, there's unfinished business in dealing with anti-Semitism on the home front. And even though Minneapolis was overwhelmingly at this time a white Protestant city, there were communities, about 2% of the total population in each case, of Blacks and of Jews. There was a Catholic community as well. And all of these groups of GIs were coming home with the idea that there's some unfinished business here, that after all the blood and treasure that was spent defeating German fascism, Italian fascism, Imperial Japanese fascism, what do we do about the moral imperfections that are still pervasive on the home front? And so that's the backdrop for Hubert Humphrey running for mayor. And he understood that this pressing question was being asked about what kind of country is America, which is now going to be, along with the Soviet Union, the reigning superpower of the world. How do we answer the moral questions that are lingering at home? And as if to put that point even to a sharper edge, incredibly, in that spring of 45, at the same time that, as I said before, newsreels of the death camps are being shown, articles are appearing, there was a series of attacks in North Minneapolis on Jewish teenagers and kids by white Protestant gangs. And they're being shoved through windows and told, show me some of that Jew blood. They're being beaten up and made to give the Heil Hitler salute. Their cars were being forced off the road. And there is a terrible history of this kind of anti-Black and anti-Jewish bigotry in Minneapolis up to this point. I think your listeners have to forget everything we think we know about Blue Minneapolis of more recent decades and be brought back to a period in time when Minneapolis was homogeneous, parochial, very intolerant, and had been the subject of articles in national magazines on that basis. That was its notoriety. And it's so incredibly here at this moment in time when you think there'd be the greatest sympathy to the Jewish community because of the revelations of the Holocaust, these attacks are taking place. And the existing mayor, Marvin Klein, and his police chief go to this huge mass meeting in North Minneapolis, then the Jewish and Black neighborhood in town. 2,000 people are at a junior high school, and they kind of wave it all off. They're like, this is just youngsters misbehaving. This is just, hooligans. Don't get so upset about it. And people at that meeting are saying explicitly, people from the Jewish community are saying, is this why our boys died? Is this what our boys fought for? And there's absolutely the comparable sense in the Black community of Minneapolis at the same time, because the great newspaper editor and publisher Cecil Newman of The Spokesman was writing about these episodes of anti-Semitism and very correctly drawing parallels to episodes of racism in the city. And so Humphrey takes on this issue directly. Humphrey says, this isn't teenage hooligans. This isn't just, a few renegade kids. Minneapolis has been warned in books, in media, by people in the Black and Jewish and Catholic and liberal Protestant communities for years now that it has a problem, and no one's dealt with it. And Humphrey said it was inevitable, it was going to get violent, and now it has. So what are we going to do about it? And he lays out this 5-plank platform of civil rights, which becomes his main basis for running as mayor of Minneapolis. And what's really extraordinary here is that in a lot of ways, it makes no sense for Hubert Humphrey to do this. And Hubert Humphrey, and we can talk more about his upbringing later on, as I sometimes say, he's a very vanilla guy from a very vanilla place.
South Dakota, right?
Yeah, well, he grows up, he's
Yeah.
white,
Yeah.
Protestant himself,
Yep.
grows up Methodist. He grows up in a little fly speck of a place called Dolan, South Dakota, which is also very homogeneous, very isolated, very parochial. And there's no reason for him to care about these battles against racism and civil rights if it was all based on his own ancestry. And politically speaking, if you're running for mayor of Minneapolis and the Black and the Jewish vote comes out collectively to maybe 5% of the total, and if you add the Catholic vote, maybe it's up to 20%, that is not a winning platform or winning coalition, except that Humphrey made this case so compellingly. And at this moment in time, there are a lot of other GIs coming home too, who were part of the majority population, but had come home also with this sense of, look what we just fought against abroad. Now we've got to finish the battle at home. And I think if Humphrey had run for mayor this time on that same platform in some other year, he might not have won. But I think the city of Minneapolis really had ears for what he was saying and a desire to reform itself in 1945. And he ends up winning this smashing victory.
You talk about his caring, and one of the things that is very important as a theme throughout your book is his compassion, if you will, and his optimism, and his ability to talk to people, excitement. He just inspired a lot of people wherever he went to go to when he
Yes.
went to all these events and talked about it. And your book does a really great job of highlighting how Humphrey felt about the war's effort and how he was going to, on the home front, fight for the ideals that they were fighting for abroad and bring them to Minneapolis. So I thought that's important. And then you talk about all the human rights in the fight back then. There's a lot of parallels between then and now, and some
Mhm.
of the things that we're dealing with and facing today. And and here we are looking back at Humphrey and the history that he did in the start in the fight of doing all that back then.
And I think
Yeah.
it creates almost a blueprint for us to look at. I mean, he got young people together, he got women together, he brought the Christian groups together,
Mhm.
and cared about having folks all be on the same page. I mean, I love
Yes.
the fact that he wanted to fight discrimination. He wanted to fight violence on every corner of the city. He wanted to make sure that there wasn't racial intolerance. And I have to believe after the war, people were more open to that concept, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you identified a couple of key things. First of all, he did have those people skills that you can't fake. As a journalist, I'm always critical of many of my fellow journalists for being totally cynical about politics and about people in public service, and to think that anyone could do this. There's no talent. Everyone's compromised. Everyone's sleazy. And it omits the fact that a lot of people go into out of public service out of idealism, and it omits the fact that there are real skills to doing politics well.
Right.
And the kind of connection Humphrey felt to every individual he met, his ability to listen to people, his ability to understand the difficulty and struggles people were going through in their lives, that you can't fake that. And voters always do know the difference. They know the difference even now. We know that some people are good at politics and some may have great ideals, but they're not good at the skills of campaigning or governing. So that was absolutely an important piece for Humphrey. And also, as you were saying, um, he was a coalition builder, and he was able to accomplish, and we'll talk more about this later perhaps, a lot of his legislative agenda as mayor of Minneapolis over and against a recalcitrant city council, because he outflanked the council by putting together these broad coalitions of citizens and activating grassroots people. And when he put together these mayor's councils on civil rights and other issues, he would get people from labor and management. He would get people who'd been Republicans and Democrats. He would get people from all races and religious groups. And all he cared about is that they could work together on that one issue. He wasn't looking for a whole list of loyalty oaths. He was looking for commitment on one issue. And it was
And back in
very,
those days, the city council was 3 times the size that it is today, and it was 2-year terms. I think you're exactly right, and you hit on that he had these skills. Throughout my life, I've had the humbling experience of being told story after story after story. You know, one in Jackson County when a girl had met him when he was 14 with her dog. I forget the name of the dog, but then, you know, years later, my grandfather's running across the street as a United States Senator in the Jackson County parade and seeing the same woman and saying, "How's your dog so-and-so?" I mean, this guy,
Yeah.
so they say that he had a photographic memory, but it was more than that. He was the smartest man in the room, or person in the room most of the time. But I
Right.
think you touched on a little bit, but I do think that comes from his ethos. You know, my great-grandfather was kind of the town political guy who would have record albums of and so my grandfather saw that, but he also saw the strife of not only the Depression, but the locusts that had come to their farm before, and he had gone through seeing his dad really struggle, I think. And then, of course, and you articulated so well in the book, his chum friend and some of the other things and adventures they got into. But then you fast forward it to when he's finishing up his master's program, and he decides to go to LSU. And he also, during that time, not only sees the shanties and the real difference between the levels of class, if you will, down there. But he also is debate partners with Huey Long's son, Russell Long. And
wild.
could you imagine trying to debate those two?
No.
So, all along, there's this ethos that he brings to this, and it is this joy. And I think and again, I was 8, but I know from stories from my dad and uncles, he saw it as a challenge sometimes. But, he was great friends with Ronald Reagan. He was great friends with Jesse Helms.
And he got things done.
Yes, I will say this. When I was an intern, actually for Biden, back then you could go over and get lost in the Capitol, and I actually had to run over one of these envelopes that you had to get everybody to sign. They had the little, anyway. And I have to go quick, so I asked the senator if I can ride up in the Senate elevator, and it's none other than Strom Thurmond.
Oh, my gosh.
And Buck is my nickname, and it comes from another great U.S. Senator in Minnesota, Muriel Buck, who is my grandmother, taught me how to swim out of Waverly and everything else. She also grounded me the first time, but that's a whole other story.
She's tough.
He was just a person, and they had just a really good heart, but had also felt the empathy that I think so many people are looking for, especially in politicians today. And he was really able to empathize, or at least sympathize with folks, and then bring them together, right? Desperate, even civil rights. There was a whole left flank that they had to, he and many people, frankly, African-American leaders from Minnesota who helped, Roy Wilkins and others who helped bring kind of that left side back to the coalition because, and of course, Samuel does an incredible job of this too, but the coalition was a great effort in the Civil Rights Act of 64, but the Voting Rights Act of 65, which is now under assault every day, was absolutely the enfranchisement. And what he believed was that if you empower someone in their society, then they will make it better.
And we're going to address that in the next segment. You all probably heard that the music came up and I ignored it and went in and allowed us to keep talking, which I wanted to do. We do need to go to break now. But when we come back, let's talk about the voters' rights. Let's talk about then and now and what kind of impact that Hubert Humphrey made and how it's being challenged today. And we'll be right back after a few messages. You can go ahead and play that music again, my friend Patrick. There we go. And we'll be right back after a few short messages. Thanks so much for listening, and stay tuned for more good conversation. Welcome back to Connections Radio Show, where we talk about ideas that matter. So glad that you have joined us and are part of our conversation about Into the Bright Sunshine and how Minnesota was lighting the way to civil rights way back in the 40s. And Samuel Freedman has written an amazing book, Into the Bright Sunshine. It's coming out in paperback this fall in 2026. Go check Amazon or your favorite local bookseller. In this book, he reveals the gritty and early career of Mayor Hubert Humphrey and the local foot soldiers who pushed him to change American politics forever. Also joining us is Buck Humphrey, who's the grandson of Vice President Hubert Humphrey, currently the vice chair of the 3rd Congressional District of DFL, 2002 DFL nominee for Secretary of State, started in the DFL in 94 and has been going strong ever since with all kinds of amazing things. One of the things that I think is going to be really particularly interesting for this segment coming up is the work he did as the chief of the Office of Communication for the Citizenship and Immigration. And he interned also with Biden. And there's some interesting stories that I would love to have him share also about Biden. And we have Mike Rothman, a good friend to Buck Humphrey and a good friend to all who know him. He is a good person. He is the former Minnesota Commerce Commissioner, currently active in election and campaign law. He ran for Attorney General in 2018 and has been active in the DFL for many years. And both sides of his family have been active in the DFL for generations. And a big thank you to Kit Bix for helping put this all together. She is a DFL activist, a retired academic, and the lead producer for our Other Jewish Voices series on Connections. So we left off thinking about the voters' rights, but let's back up a little bit. And I'd love to have Mike, you share a little bit about the optimism and following up on what Buck shared at the last segment about the ethos in the connections that he had.
What I love is all the stories in history about how Humphrey was optimistic, from being the happy warrior to fighting for social justice and fighting for human rights at every level. Um, I think, to put an anchor in what happened in Minneapolis, and we talked about this, an important election to become mayor, was the fact that he was able to bring a coalition together to bring Minneapolis into a new era, basically, and it was an example for others around the country for developing government and to step into the issue and take on the issues of racial injustice. And he fought very hard for that.
When I told my brother I was doing this radio show, he goes, I remember when Hubert Humphrey came out to Mound, Minnesota, at the end of Lake Minnetonka, and was in a parade, but he stopped to say hello to me.
Yeah.
And that kindness, I mean, my brother is 70 now, and he still cherishes the memory of being able to shake
So
Hubert
maybe
Humphrey's
this
hand.
is something that will also impress that point. Grandpa had many political foes. Some didn't necessarily like him, but one of them that was throughout his time, and they had certainly a certain connection because they both ran against John F. Kennedy, but President Nixon.
Yeah.
And Grandpa was 1977. They actually made him Senate Vice President pro temp, the only one ever in the history of the United States, because they didn't think he would last this long. But anyway, it's Christmas Eve of 77. And Grandpa's on what they used to call Watts lines.
Yes.
And he was literally sitting in this lazy boy that he had at Waverly and would just dial, and his staff would dial, and the next person was on the line, and the next person was on the line. And as he's doing this for, pretty much the whole month of December, to be honest with you, he died on January 13th, 1978. Anyway, he hears that Richard Nixon is really depressed and not doing well and is at his home in California. And so he calls up the president. And they talk for, you could hear this story 6 different ways, but from other people. But they talk for a good couple hours. And at the end of it, and Nixon had not been back to Washington, D.C. since August of 74. And he said, now, Dick, I'm going to die. And it's going to be soon, and I want you to come to my funeral. And so that was the first time that he had been back in Washington, D.C. And my memory, because I'm 8, was of these long, long, long lines in the middle of a very rainy, cold Washington, D.C. out the Capitol to see my grandfather lying in state. And they bring the motorcade up, and we get out, and there's basically 3 circular rows of people in the rotunda. And I'm in the second with the families, and I'm petting this woman's fur coat in front of me. That's what my mom says, and that was Pat Nixon's fur coat. So anyway, but the point is that he, on his deathbed, he wanted to reach out and make Richard Nixon feel better, welcome, and that, we're all in this together as Americans.
Such deep connection.
I want to add something to that about what it meant for Humphrey to reach out to Nixon in that way, because it's not just that he lost the 68 election to Nixon, and it's not just that on some issues, although not on all issues, but on some they parted politically, because after all, Republicans were different then, and Nixon in Congress had been pro-civil rights and, helped form the EPA. But one of Nixon's pre-Watergate dirty tricks cost Hubert Humphrey the 1968 election. It wasn't just that he happened to beat him, it's that peace talks were about to begin between North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the United States, and voters were shifting over to vote for Humphrey. There was a surge at the end of the campaign, and he was going to overtake Nixon to win. And Nixon went through back channels he had through the nationalist Chinese to get the South Vietnamese to pull out of the peace talks. he told them, if you don't do the peace talks, I'll cut you a better deal. And when the peace talks fell apart, that cost Humphrey the election. So what it meant for him to then show this grace to Nixon is astonishing. But what I want to add to a story like that, and your earlier mentions about the companionable relations Humphrey had ultimately with segregationists like Jesse Helms and Strom Thurmond, is that a lot of listeners might misinterpret that as this meant that Humphrey had no principles and everyone was in the Senate club together and you could befriend and hang out and, share a glass of bourbon with anybody. And that may have been a part of it, particularly towards the end of Humphrey's life, when I think people felt across the political spectrum great tenderness for him. But Humphrey took political risks. Humphrey had backbone. Humphrey would stand up for his principles.
Right.
Humphrey's great moment at the 1948 convention, giving this speech on the issue of civil rights, drives Strom Thurmond out of the Democratic Party.
And all the Dixiecrats.
Humphrey, when he gets to the Senate in 49 to start his first term, hires a Black Senate aide, first one, and brings him into the Senate dining room to forcibly desegregate it. And as a result of that, all those people like the Strom Thurmonds and Jesse Helmses of that time, those two may not have been in the Senate then, but their ilk made sure that Humphrey's life was made as miserable as possible during his early years in the Senate. Don't just take my word for it. Read Robert Caro in his Johnson biography. He is chapter and verse of what they did to try to humiliate Humphrey, because they had never forgiven him for winning the battle on civil rights within the Democratic Party.
Let's not forget the very core of his 1948 speech, right? I thought it would be nice to if we just remember this. That Humphrey it was speaking to the convention, arguing for the minority platform, and one of the most important things he says is, to those who say that this civil rights program is an infringement on states' rights, I say this, that the time has arrived in America for the Democratic Party to get out of the shadows of states' rights and to walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights. It was absolutely fundamentally a critical moment in national history to change the dynamics of the Democratic Party, the national scene between the North and the South, and having that win at that time was absolutely critical. And we still today, with those tectonic shifts back then, are still we've inherited that. That's where we live today.
Absolutely.
And into the bright sunshine. What an optimistic metaphor. How can we go to something brighter? And I think that the optimism, as you mentioned earlier, Mike, is really what got people wanting to be optimistic as well. We want to have a positive. We want to believe in something good. World can get diverted into all kinds of other issues, as we've seen in the last administration and the one before.
Yeah, we could all use a lot of that optimism today.
Yes.
And I think it's important, the words that he chose, because he could, and if I've seen the speech, he's crossed out a bunch of words. But anyway, but he chose.
I love that.
He didn't say more civil rights, because there'd been Civil Rights Act. He specifically said human rights. And if I can just beg your audience to think of a higher humanity through it all, and that we were a people that needed to move forward together fairly. I mean, you can cascade all the other kind of rights and fights and non-discrimination versus discrimination, and empowering African Americans by the vote, and look at what they use the National Guard for in terms of elections, as opposed to what's going on right now. I mean, there's just a very stark difference, and it all begins, as Mike said, and as our good, I call him the good professor, but Samuel has articulated so well, is that that was purposeful. He was not going to back down on that. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, the stories I've been told and read in history is that, back then the old bosses kind of ran the convention, and it was a hot convention, and there's no air conditioning, and he had the delegates on their feet for what seemed like a good, probably 20 minutes, but it was probably like
Right.
6. But think about it. This is a 34-year-old mayor from
Wow.
Minneapolis with Orb Freeman,
Yeah.
and they're up there burning it up. I mean, they literally changed the entire dynamic of the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
Right. I wanted to come in and give more of the historical context. Thanks for starting it, Buck. Right. At this point, he's 37 years old.
37, sorry.
He's held one, he was 34 and he was elected. Now he's 37. He's held one elected office in his entire life. Minneapolis then is now a mid-sized city. It's not New York. It's not LA. It's not Chicago. And at the convention, Harry Truman is going to be nominated by the party. Truman, through, as Buck was saying, the party bosses who control the party, sends the word out, I don't want the civil rights plank with any teeth in it. Truman wants to do what FDR always did, which was to try to placate the Southern segregationists in the party with fuzzy language that they could use to excuse Jim Crow. So that's what Truman is saying he wants the platform to be. Then you have the people like Strom Thurmond, who have gotten wind of what Humphrey and the liberals in the party want to do. And Thurmond is saying, if there is word one about civil rights, we're going to bolt from the convention and form a third party. And implicit in that threat is we're going to take away Truman's ability to win these states in the South, and he's going to lose the election to Thomas Dewey, or it'll get thrown into the House of Representatives. And Thurmond maybe thought he could even win on a vote in the House of Representatives. And again, younger listeners, at this time, the Democratic Party was the party of segregation. It was reversed. The Republicans really were the party of Lincoln, not just in name, but in policy. And the Democrats were the party that tolerated Jim Crow to win the votes in the South. Anyway, so Humphrey has Truman against him. He's Thurmond ready to vote. One of Truman's people comes to Humphrey on the floor of the convention and says, if you give that speech, your career is over, which meant specifically the party wasn't going to give him any support in running for Senate that fall in Minnesota. And then he'd be kind of politically at the end of the road at age 37. And so the guts it took for Humphrey to give that speech, knowing his whole political life was on the line, knowing that the president was against him. Truman writes in his diaries that Humphrey's a crackpot. A crackpot, that's what he thinks. And so just the guts of that speech are incredible. And you're right about the optimism. And when I think about the way Humphrey framed that issue and many others, I'm reminded of a minister at an African-American church who I wrote about in my second book. And he used to describe himself as being a critical lover of the institution of Black church. And Hubert Humphrey was a critical lover of America with both parts. He loved America. He wanted it to be the greatest nation it could be, to live up to all of its promises, but he was never shy about calling it out for falling short or betraying those promises.
Mike, tell me about how you feel about that bravery and what he brought to the table at that point in bringing people together.
My thought would be this. I would love to be in the same room with him, to be here and to bring him into the current state of politics, and to say to ourselves, we need that spirit. We need to fight. We have to remember, Sam, exactly what you said. We're a nation of ideals. We need those ideals to be fought for every day. We need to work hard. And remember, we're long from that. Even at that time, Humphrey said, we're long from where we were. We haven't made any changes, and we still need a lot of work to do here and abroad. And I think, the then and now, the parallels are very important. I think to myself, everything that we've done in the last, like, for example, we brought it up at the beginning of the show. We've had the protests in the streets of Minneapolis recently. We had protests in the 60s, but for somebody to stand up and firmly fight for those ideals in the face of all that he personally was, his whole future was at stake, he just grabbed onto that and fought for it and made us understand how important it is. And I think we need a lot of that for today.
And how can each of us
Right.
look at that?
One of the key things Humphrey did then that I think echoes now with the great way Minneapolis stood up against Operation Metro Surge, is he was really great at using the language of religion on behalf of liberal ideas. And a lot of his coalition involved people from the liberal religious community, Black churches, Reform and conservative Jews, his own, people from the Methodist and Lutheran and Congregationalist communities in the Twin Cities. And we saw a lot of that as key to mobilizing people during Operation Metro Surge. A lot of the mobilization happened through mosques and synagogues and churches of different kinds. And a lot of the language for opposing people being disappeared from their homes, people being shot down, was language that used kind of the values-based language that comes out of religious tradition. And that's, I think, one of the most important carryovers from his time to what we saw just a number of months ago here.
And I think it's important too. When I was saying what I was saying, I think we have that fighting spirit. We are there. We were just at the DFL convention this last weekend, and everybody is fighting and standing up. And I just want to encourage everybody out there, like you said, to individually stand up and continue to fight.
Mike, I have not, like you said, I've been involved as a state delegate first since '94, but in and out all over the process, and certainly probably out of the womb. But I have never seen the amount of people involved in, and Samuel, you talk about religion. There's faith in Minnesota, there's Isaiah, it's Christians, Muslims, Jews, all saying really no to tyranny and these core bedrock principles that are un-American. As far as I can see, and my grandfather would absolutely have not only opposed it, but brought you to a different place. And I often wonder, and we won't get into this conversation because the internet didn't even exist when he was around. So we won't go down that rabbit hole. But
he was the one-man internet.
He was a one-man internet, and literally there are quotes, to this day, the moral test of government and everything else that you hear that are brought up. But this guy, he didn't just do it in the city of Minneapolis. He did it in farm country. He did it in international, in Food for Peace, and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And even when he was vice president, and when it was popular to be a supporter of the Vietnam intervention at that point, he had wrote a very substantial, and I'm not a historian, but a very substantial document to the president, really talking about why did we want to go in further, and also the bombing and that type of thing. And maybe I'm conflating a couple things, but he even challenged within his own presidency. Now we know where that got him, which wasn't very far. But think about that now.
Did it change the world?
It was trying to, but you think about it now. You have no Republican who is standing in and saying this is not right. So, and I'm not saying Republican, Democrat, whatever, but there's no internal questioning going on.
No backbone right now.
Yeah, and so I think
up.
There's that too. Yeah.
Right. And I want to go to something else that comes out.
I would love. I do need to go to the next segment. I love our conversations. I wish we didn't have to have a
It's great.
a break.
We want to continue,
but we do, and we will. We will continue on. We'll be back just after a few short supporting commercials that keep us going and keep the lights on, which we love them for. Here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. We'll be right back. Thank you for joining us today on Connections Radio Show. We have had a wonderful conversation as we discuss going into the bright sunshine, the Minnesota lighting the way for civil rights through our Hubert Humphrey. Amazing show with amazing conversations. Thank you to author-winning Samuel Freedman and giving us insight from his book, Into the Bright Sunshine, which I also want to remind folks that it's coming out in paperback this fall, and revealing the texture and the layers and the things that we may not know about Hubert Humphrey that we can treasure even more as a Minnesotan who made a difference and continues to inspire us for us to make a difference. We've also had Buck Humphrey, his grandson. I also love that, Buck, that your nickname comes from your grandmother.
Yes. Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. It's wonderful to have Buck, who also is the vice chair for the 3rd Congressional District at the DFL and has served in many other roles, and both at the Minnesota and at the federal level. So thank you for your work. And we have our good friend Mike Rothman, who's the former Minnesota Commerce Commissioner and currently active in election and campaign law, which we will talk more about in our next show. We are going to have this be a series. This is the first of, I'm aiming for a 3-part series. So Mike will be able to give us insight about that. In wrapping up today, I'd love to have each of us share what our takeaways are and get ready for us to launch into our next show that we will be talking about additional things to think about with Hubert Humphrey. I'm going to start with you, Buck.
Oh, where to begin? Well, I think it's absolutely critical that people do study his earlier career, and Samuel Freedman's done an incredible job with this book. And oh, by the way, you can listen to it on Audible too, or audio. If you're one of those like me, I go to the beach or the lake and I listen to Samuel. It's awesome. But what it does is, you talked about the layers. I mean, the whole 5th chapter on the northeast side of Minneapolis, and you really get this visual, and he uses words like tender and like just describing. It really put me literally, I think, in the shoes of my grandfather, and then those incredibly tough decisions, as Mike just articulated, and certainly Samuel did in 48, and some of those early lessons he learned from coalition building, but also from, I hate to say it, standing up to the man.
Yeah.
I mean, and changing things, and knowing that things deep in his soul weren't right about the Democratic Party, and that if he was going to go forward, was only going to go forward on those right, moral, ethical issues that were too human as its core, not just civil, and the laws, and those are very important. Those are all important. But the fact that we would hopefully do unto others as others would do unto us, and be kind and build coalitions and lift up people and not tear them down.
The prairie ethos.
Yes, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
Mike.
I'm so happy to be here and to talk about all this. To me, Sam, your book brings out some very important themes back then and today. The fact that out of the Depression, Humphrey learned from friends, learned from the history, learned from his father and the family and everything that was happening, to be compassionate. Be compassionate for your friends and your neighbors and for others. And that he fought against intolerance. He fought every day, every time there was intolerance. He worked very hard on the issues of social justice of his time, and to work hard, not just alone, but with others in coalition building. And those lessons are the lessons that we learn from today, that we continue to do today. And then and now we have very similar issues and all of that, but we've come a long ways, and we know that we have a long way to go yet. And all of us that are both individually and working together on these issues need to keep that in mind. So it's a terrific book, and I encourage everybody to read it. And I think it's particularly poignant today as we fight against some of the injustices we see now, the intolerance and the totalitarianism that we're seeing around the world and around the country.
I also want to do a quick, again, thank you to Kit for bringing us together.
Yay, Kit.
Kit Vicks, who's a talented co-producer and lead producer for the Other Jewish Voices, and we're grateful for all of her insights that she provides. We have less than a minute. If you want to give us a quick, big top line, Samuel, and then I'll share a little bit about the next in our series on this show.
I think the takeaways from Humphrey are you have to know what your inviolable moral principles and political principles are, what you won't compromise on, but you have to be flexible about building coalitions in order to achieve them.
And with that, perfect note to end on here on Connections Radio Show, where we're talking about going into that bright sunlight that Hubert shared and Samuel Freedman wrote about. And we will be doing another in this series. So we will be posting and promoting the series that deals with Hubert Humphrey, What Can We Learn as a Blueprint for the Civil Rights and Human Rights.